Familiar text of Scripture that we can talk about all kinds of aspects from it, historically or whatever. I want to think with you for a little bit today out of that text about what was Satan really saying to Eve when he contradicted what God had said. God said there was one tree in which they had been forbidden to eat, and once you eat of that tree, you shall surely die. And all Satan did was he simply convinced Eve in some form that that wasn't true, that somehow they could eat of that tree and survive it. And I suppose that generally speaking, we think about the idea of death, meaning that what ushered in that moment was the fact that physical death was unknown until that point. The garden was sustaining man, and in some senses would have continued to sustain man indefinitely if they had not partaken of the tree in which God had forbidden them. Now, we can argue the idea that God's foreknowledge would have understood, and we know He already had a plan before the foundations of the world how He would save man. He knows what, it's odd, right, in some ways when you think about it. He knows what man's going to do, and yet He created us anyway. Food for thought, side point to this morning, but He created us anyway, knowing the kinds of choices we would make and knowing what the ultimate cost it would take to reconcile us back to Him. And yet that's the God that we serve and honor. But it's interesting to think about the idea that the closest thing that man has ever experienced to heaven on earth is not West Virginia, which is a beautiful place to live, but almost heaven was the garden prior to sin. It was a place where Adam and Eve lived in perfect harmony in relationship with God. There was no good and evil at that point. Prior to their partaking of that tree there in chapter 3 of the book of Genesis, there was no sin. Nobody had ever committed a sin. There was no impurity. Everything about God's relationship with man at that point was pure. Until they decided that Satan's lie was more impressive than God's truth, and were convinced that if I eat of that tree, even though God said I would die, I won't. And Eve ate of that tree and gave to her husband, and he did eat, and they ushered in death. But what I want you to think about a little bit with me this morning, though, is what is death, right? What is death more than just ceasing to breathe, right? There's more to the concept of death than just our physical body giving out to the way of this world and eventually no longer functioning here upon the earth. And when you go into definitions, often when we talk about death, we talk about it being a separation, right? Death, earthly, physical death is a separation of soul and body. That at our moment of our death, our soul separates from this earthly temple and tabernacle in which it had resided with. When we talk about the death that sin brings, we talk about the separation that death creates between us and God. That's the kind of death I want to speak to you about this morning. Because it is concerning that some men might convince themselves that that's an impossibility. That it's an impossibility for me to ever really be separated from God. That there is no chance by which that I would ever experience that kind of death. That I can always be connected no matter what. I will always be connected to God and never separated from Him. And yet God said, in the moment you eat of that tree, you shall surely die. You will be separated from me. Satan says, no, you won't. And they believed it. And so how do we discern the truth? How do we make sure that we understand the warnings of God and appreciate the instructions that He gives that might help us know that separation from Him is a reality that we need to be cautioned about? And so let me pursue that with you for just a little while today. And when I think about this idea of you shall not surely die, I want you to back up and look at chapter 2 and verse 17 as well of the book of Genesis to kind of appreciate what the simple instructions had been up to this point. Verse 17, chapter 2. But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. What I want you and I to simply appreciate is you can't get any simpler than that, right? You could not have had a simpler instruction than eat of that tree, you shall surely die. There was no misunderstanding. This wasn't a difficult concept. There wasn't something so challenging beyond their scope of understanding that they just couldn't process. No, this is clearly understood. Eat of that tree and you shall surely die. Go back to what the serpent said in verse 4 of chapter 3. Then the serpent said to the woman, you will not surely die. God's not telling you the truth about this circumstance. That you'll never be separated from Him. That death will never occur. You will always have the same blessings and the same benefits, the same relationship, and that will never be severed. And they're going to learn the difficult way that God was right and Satan lied. Verse 24 of chapter 3. Speaking of God, go to verse 23, might be even more helpful. Therefore the Lord God sent him out of the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken. So he drove out the man. Have you ever stopped to think about that, by the way? He didn't say he invited man to leave, right? He didn't say he cordially asked Adam and Eve to depart the garden. No, God drove them. I imagine they were reluctant to want to go. I imagine this wasn't something that they want. It's not recorded for us, and so I don't want to be overly speculative here, but I imagine there was a lot of hopes and wishes and thoughts and processes of how can we correct this? How can we fix this? How can we resolve this? And God's answer was, there is no fixing this now. There will be a later time when the one who will bruise his heel will eventually, the one bruised will actually come back and bruise his head. But he drives out the man, and he placed cherubim at the east of the Garden of Eden and a flaming sword which turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. A horrible feeling of separation. And you imagine being not just asked to leave, but they were driven from the garden. And when they would turn back to look at where that place once was, there stands this cherubim, and it's guarding it, saying, you can no longer have access to the tree of life. Time doesn't permit, but the Revelator speaks about the access is in heaven to that tree of life now, and whether that's figurative or literal, we'll find out someday, Lord willing. But Jesus becomes the source of life by which we can go into that eternal state. But these folks were absolutely, my point is simple this morning, Adam and Eve were separated from God. And the blessings of that garden when they chose to listen to the lie of Satan. And any idea or thought process that God would never do that should end there. He did it with the very first man and woman on the planet. And for us to convince ourselves that God would never do that argues against the very basic history of man in our beginning. But that's not the only text that talks about this idea. Go to the very last book of the Old Testament. In the book of Malachi. And I just want you to notice with me the language in this text. Malachi chapter 2, verse 10. So the prophet says, have we not all one Father? He's asking these questions. Have we not all one Father? not one God created us? Why do we deal treacherously with one another by profaning the covenant of the Father? So he's concerned about their behaviors towards one another, reminds them of the connectivities they should be having with God. And then he says, Judah has dealt treacherously. And an abomination has been committed in Israel and in Jerusalem. For Judah has profaned the Lord's holy institution, which he loves. He has married the daughter of a foreign god. Notice, may the Lord cut off from the tents of Jacob the man who does this, being awake and aware, yet who brings an offering to the Lord of hosts. May the Lord cut off those who deal treacherously with His laws, His instructions, His guidance, the things that He desires. May the Lord cut off those who would deal with God's laws and instructions in the manner in which that we should entreat one another in profane ways. Adam and Eve evidence that God will separate. Death does come. Malachi's text illustrates the same concept that God does, will, can cut man off. Notice verse 17, same passage, Malachi 2. You have wearied the Lord with your words. I like to chit-chat and talk. You know me. Right? I like to sit around and tell stories and that kind of thing. And I suppose my children would tell you, when they have to hear me tell the same story for the 16th billionth time, that they are wearied, right? By hearing the same thing over and over and over again. My point, friends, is simply this. Should we not fear a state or condition that's being described as they have wearied God with their words? They'd use lots of them. They'd make lots of promises. They'd make lots of vows. They would say all kinds of things before the Lord. They would promise all kinds of things, but they never honored any of it. And Malachi says God is tired of it. By the way, keep historical narrative in your back of your mind when you think about that. God was so wearied by them, He quit talking to them for 400 years after Malachi. For 400 years, God had been so wearied by His people. Rather than honored, rather than glorified, rather than elevated, He had become so wearied by His people, He cut them off. And never said another word for another 400 years until the days of John the Baptist, basically, and the arrival of Jesus. God can, will, does, has separated Himself from man when man wearies Him, when man disobeys Him, when man believes the lies of Satan over what God's truths have been. It will, can, has happened. And this concept that God really won't do that, God won't really judge somebody, misses the historical narrative. And notice their attitude, verse 17. You have wearied the Lord with your words, yet you say, in what way have we wearied Him? And that you say, everyone who does evil is good in the sight of the Lord, and He delights in them, or where is the God of justice? You want to know how you've wearied Him? You have said God doesn't care whether you do good or evil. That's how you've wearied Him. You have decided that God is disinterested in the behaviors of man. You have decided that God does not concern Himself anymore with what is moral and what is immoral. He's not worried about any of that anymore. He won't cut you off because of that. You have worn Him out. They would even decry, where is the God of justice? We're still here. And haven't faced any calamity for our decisions and choices. And they've convinced themselves He will not cut them off, and then they're about to experience it nationwide for 400 years. God can and will. There are others who may convince themselves that they are in a state or condition or relationship of some type or kind that would never lend itself to the possibility that God would cut them off. Notice John chapter 8. John chapter 8 and verse 31. So Jesus speaks to the Jews who had believed in Him in verse 31. He says, if, conditional by the way, you abide in my word, you are my disciples indeed. And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. They answered Him, notice this, they answered Him, we are Abraham's descendants and have never been in bondage to anyone. How can you say you will be made free? And you've heard me say before, they didn't know their history very well, did they? They had been enslaved several times. Jesus answered them, most assuredly I say to you, whoever commits sin is a slave of sin, and a slave does not abide in the house forever. You don't have permanent residency just because you have it in a moment doesn't mean you have it forever. That's the point. Does not abide in the house forever, but a son abides forever. Therefore, if the Son makes you free, you shall be free indeed. I know that you are Abraham's descendants, but you seek to kill me because my word has no place in you. I speak what I have seen with my father, and you do what you have seen with your father. They answered and said to him, Abraham is our father. Jesus says to them, if you were Abraham's children, you would do the works of Abraham. If you were really those descendants of Abraham, if you were really those who were desiring to follow a pattern of God, you would behave differently towards me. You do the deeds of your father. Or rather, verse 40, but now you seek to kill me, a man who has told you the truth, which I heard from God. Abraham did not do this. You do the deeds of your father. Then they said to him, we were not born of fornication. We have one Father, which is God. You ever have one of those moments where you're in a conversation, right? And it's oops, we gave the wrong answer the first time. We be Abraham's seed. We are Abraham's children. Jesus said, well, you're in contradiction with Abraham if that's the case. You're not treating him as your father because he wouldn't seek to kill me. He wouldn't behave in these ways. That's not, well, then, no, we're not born of that circumstance. We have one Father, that's God. So Jesus' response, verse 42, if God were your Father, you would love me. For I proceeded forth and came from God, nor have I come of myself, but He sent me. Why do you not understand my speech? Because you are not able to listen to my word. You are of your father the devil, the same one that lied to Eve, and that Adam took bait as well. You are of your father the devil, and the desires of your father you want to do. He was a murderer from the beginning. It does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own resources, for he is a liar and the father of it. Side point, by the way. He said, when Satan speaks, he's always lying. Isn't that interesting? It had become his character. Don't ever think that a little lie here and a little lie there won't create a problem. Because the next thing you know, you're in a pattern of lies. And everything that comes out of our mouth can't be believed. That's the reality for Satan. You can believe anything he said. But because I tell you the truth, verse 45, you do not believe me. Which of you convicts of me of sin? And if I tell the truth, why do you not believe me? He who is of God hears God's words. Therefore you do not hear because you are not, notice it, you are not of God. We're Abraham's seed. Jesus said, doesn't matter. We have the descendants. Right? We're the descendants of that Israelite nation that God had promised. We're of that great promise that was made to Abraham that great things would happen. God said, through Jesus, it doesn't matter. God has cut you off. Why? Because you don't do what He says. You don't listen to His instructions. You don't follow the guidance that He provides. You have spent a lifetime, generations, where you haven't listened to Him. You are not of God. All the claims, all the proclamations didn't change the reality. They had separated themselves from God. Oh, but we have one Father. Well, you don't act like it. In fact, you've acted like your father, the devil, and God you because you've rejected Him. And when you reject God's message, it creates and brings separation between ourselves and Him. Don't ever convince ourselves, in other words, friends, that it can't happen to me. That's what they thought. We are Abraham's seed. It can't happen to us. And Jesus says, not only can it, it has. You are not of God the Father. You are of Satan, your father. That's the bold declaration Jesus makes in that text. That's who your real father is. It's not Abraham because he wouldn't seek to kill me, and it is not the God the Father because he's speaking a message that you're ignoring. You have a father, and he's the father of lies. And you have separated yourselves from God because of it. When we convince ourselves it can never happen to me, be careful. Be careful. None of us are immune. None of us are an exception to a rule where it could never occur to me. I could never be separated from God. It has happened. It can happen. It will happen. And we need to accept the warnings of God as it relates to it. Because that separation is real. I want you to notice Matthew chapter 13. Matthew chapter 13. Just read with me. Begin verse 36. Then Jesus sent the multitude away and went into the house, and His disciples came to Him, saying, "Explain to us the parable of the tares of the field." He answered and said to them, "He who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, the good seeds are the sons of the kingdom, but the tares are the sons of the wicked one. The enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are the angels. Therefore, as the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of this age. The Son of Man will send out His angels, and they will gather out of His kingdom all things that offend, and those who practice lawlessness, and will cast them into the furnace of fire. There will be wailing and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears to hear, let him hear." Jesus says, if you've got ears, listen to me. There's coming a time where God will separate the wheat from the tares. That's the meaning of the parable, He says. And yes, for a period of time, they will coexist. Because you can't go in early, in the analogy, you can't go early and start tearing out the tares, because when you do, you will destroy the harvest as well. You'll destroy the wheat in the process. You've got to let it all grow up, then you harvest it all and you separate it. And that's the description of the judgment that is to come in the return of Jesus, where He will gather both and He will set. Friends, I'm just trying to be sure we understand. that as pleasant as it is to think about the beauty and benefit of the promises of God, as beneficial as it is to think about the great benefit of heaven and the beauty of that place, and all of those are important concepts for us to grasp. If we ever for a moment begin to think that I could never lose out on that, then we've missed a lot of things that the Bible shares with us. And God will absolutely separate. Absolute consequence. There shall be wailing and weeping and gnashing of teeth. That's truth. Satan will tell you that's not true. Satan will tell you you'll never be separated from God. Satan will tell you you could never lose out on heaven. Satan will tell you there's no way possible for you to lose out and go and lose your soul in a hell of fire. But God says that's what's going to happen when Jesus returns. But as I close, let me share a thought from the other side of this conversation. Because there is the potential, the concern that we should have that Satan can tell us enough lies that we begin to convince ourselves that death, spiritual death, could never occur. I can never be separated from God. I can't be cut off. I can never be rejected. That lie has been being told for a long, long time, and we've got to be careful and cautious that we don't get into that way of thinking, and the next thing you know, we just do whatever we want because we don't have any fear or respect for the fact that God will create a separation someday. But may I also suggest to you that sometimes people can be convinced that they've been separated from God when they haven't been. And what I'm trying to conclude with you this morning is when God talks about separation, when God talks about death, when God talks about this distinction and this situation that we've been describing this morning, let Him define that. Man doesn't get to define who's separated from God and who isn't. Who's been embraced and who hasn't been. Who's been rejected and set aside. Who's been driven out of the garden and who hasn't. Job had some great friends. We've heard me say this before, as long as they didn't say anything. They were the best friends to Job in the world when they just sat there. But when they began to speak, it all fell apart. Notice chapter 11, verse 1. Then Zophar, the Naamathite, answered and said, should not the multitude of words be answered? And should a man full of talk be vindicated? Should your empty talk make men hold their peace? And when you mock, should no one rebuke you? For you have said, my doctrine is pure, and I am clean in your eyes. But oh, that God would speak and open His lips against you, that He should show you the secrets of wisdom, for they would double your prudence. Know therefore that God exacts from you less than your iniquity deserves. Job, you must have done something horrible because we think you probably should deserve more than you're getting. Thank you, Zophar. You're a great guy. In the midst of my misery, you found a way to make it worse. Appreciate you. Right? What's he saying? He's trying to convince Job Satan can get you away from God by lying to you that you can never be separated from Him. Do whatever you want. Or he can get you away from God by convincing you from a lie that you've already been separated when you haven't been. And the only way to discern the truth is to look to what God said. Can you search out the deep things of God? Verse 7. Can you find out the limits of the Almighty? They are higher than heaven. What can you do? Deeper than Sheol, what can you know? Their measure is longer than the earth and broader than the sea. If He passes by, imprisons and gathers to judgment, then who can hinder Him? Job's friends told him that God had already separated himself from you, so why even bother? And sometimes in life we can become convinced of that. God finally addresses them in chapter 42, by the way, and enlightens them about some realities. But friends, I'm simply asking you this morning, will you believe the truth of God, or will you continue to believe the lie that Satan provides? And both of these lies are just as treacherous. To believe the lie that you can never be cut off, I'll never be lost, I can never fall away, I'll never be separated from God. There's too much evidence in Scripture that it can, has, will continue to happen. Satan may also lie to you and get you to thinking that you're not good enough. You can't, you're not worthy. You're right, and we get all that mindset. And we begin to think that I could never be in good relationship with the Father. I don't want you to believe either one of those lies. I want you to believe the truth of God. Embrace the warning. I can be cut off if I reject God and His Word. I can honor His Word and His testimony and be in harmony and in relationship with the Creator according to His truth and according to His way. Don't let Satan trick us into believing something about death, separation, that God has not delivered. How can we help you today? To reconcile your relationship with God, to begin that, to be born again, both of water and of spirit, to encourage you to step into God's promises and trust His truth over any deceptiveness and lie that Satan may perpetrate. Can we encourage you, help you, strengthen you today? And if so, won't you come while we stand and while we sing?